Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Shabnur Shah, your podcast host, and today we are joined by the amazing Matt Takane joining us from North America. Matt is an agile coach and he leads customer delivery and internal establishments using open culture and open principles to continuously innovate a better way of working at Red Hat Consulting. Today, Matt will share his views on the overlaps and synergies between open leadership and agile. Matt, welcome. It's my pleasure to have you here.
Definitely my pleasure to be able to be here to see you and have this conversation. I feel such a new way to think, modify, adapt, and kind of like move forward between leveraging something as powerful as the open leadership characteristics with something that has been so pervasive inside of the IT industry, inside of like all project deliveries as Agile has been, and how we can really make best use of both these things to make our world just better.
Indeed, I love it when you speak, Matt. Matt, today we are here to get your views and perspectives and insights on what you think are the overlaps and synergies between open leadership and Agile. And thankfully, we've had a tremendous amount of time collaborating together and creating such products where we saw this interaction happening. But before we deep dive, I'd like to briefly introduce our listeners, to the whole open leadership definition and its 5 characteristics for added context. So, open leadership is a mindset and practice that anyone can adopt, and it focuses on serving and empowering others to achieve collective goals. Open leaders are adaptable and fluid in their roles, emphasizing 5 characteristics, which are transparency, inclusivity, collaboration, adaptability, and community. So, open leaders are ones that build organizations that embody these principles, and they foster environments where everyone is empowered to contribute and lead. Another thing that I'd like to add and clarify is that open leadership is not about titles, roles, and positions. And I like to emphasize that in every podcast for a simple reason that open leadership is about personal leadership. You could be a team member, you could be a team leader, you could be a coordinator. It doesn't matter where you are in the hierarchy. When you start applying the principles of open leadership, you become an open leader. And that's the beauty of it. And I think that's the whole mindset change that we sort of need to think about our role as an open leader. So, Matt, you and I have had the opportunity to work together at Red Hat Open Innovation Labs, and we've had some great memories and shared experiences. Personally, I've seen you work in action, and to me, you were always striving to create like new and fun and immersive ways to learn and teach others while actually delivering business value. You're very creative, hands-on, reliable, and fun to work with. And I would love to, in this podcast, bring in that essence of who you are as Matt and how you bring agile and open leadership to life through your work and interactions. So, to begin with, Matt, could you please share a little bit more about your current role and what you do at Red Hat?
Of my current role, currently I'm a principal delivery lead inside of the North America consulting services for Red Hat. I think it's actually important to also understand where, like loosely kind of where I kind of came from, like specifically around the Open Innovation Labs and some of the responsibilities and well, activities that I found myself in. As you said, it has been such a passion of mine to really create these immersive ways to learn, to teach, and drive value for customers, and even really internally. There was training that we even created that it started as an internal mechanism to onboard and upskill folks at Red Hat. And eventually it was something that we took to the customer because we found it valuable as we were creating immersive experiences to also bring the customer along that. So the training that we built internally for our own associates, we started delivering with customers so that we all had this like level playing field. So I continue to progress that at Red Hat inside of my current role currently, and I drive delivery with our customers. So both from the field perspective, and I also try to continually evolve our global impact in adopting not just like open leadership characteristics, but how can we leverage open practices agile thinking, adaptive thinking when it comes to the delivery aspects to create true business value, right? The tangible thing that drives you towards those outcomes, those outputs. But when you truly think through the outcomes that you are driving for, the outputs are actually the easier part. And you should start with why, which is where your outcomes are. And then you can kind of bring everything up. And so in my role, I'm trying to spread awareness of the differences between the two, but also specific practices that help you drive towards thinking on an outcomes perspective, knowing the outputs will actually easily flow beyond that.
That's
That was
brilliant.
a bit of a longer, just what am I doing from a delivery perspective. But those aspects is what I try and weave into anything that I do. I guess coming back to your question, whether it is a podcast, internal enablement, whether it is speaking at a conference so that I can bring newer ideas back to the team, whether it's running open leadership conversations while progressing how we think around being inclusive as a leader. What does collaboration mean, right? It's not just getting people into the room to just chat with one another. It's driving towards focus, driving towards value that you want to do. It's that alignment, right? We are trying to create a velocity, not just speed.
That's a great description. I'm glad you took the time to kind of explain this and provide deeper context. And while you were speaking, I was making some notes, then I'll have follow-on questions for you. But I'm glad you also mentioned, right up front that the importance of being outcome oriented or outcome focused as compared to being output focused. I mean, that's a different conversation, and I hope we bring it back again later during the podcast. But that's something I like to talk a lot about, because as much as I would like to believe it is something, it sounds very commonsensical that, one should be outcome focused, but is often confused with activity, right? It's about to get to those outcomes, we need to focus on activities, and we have this tendency to deep dive into doing things fast so we can get to the outcomes. So Matt, like I said, our paths first crossed at Red Hat Open Innovation Labs, and I do talk a lot about or reference Open Innovation Labs in my podcast quite a lot. Now, considering that you were part of the founding team in that sense, you started off right from the time when it was more of an incubatory idea to growing into like actually a labs practice. I was wondering if you'd be comfortable talking a little bit about how it all started. What is Open Innovation Lab, or what it was at least at that time, and what was the vision, so that I don't have to do the explaining to the audience and we can hear it directly from the pros who started it all.
Yeah, here's my short elevator pitch. Anyone has chatted with me before, it's always like story time with Matt. Open Innovation Labs started as a request from the board. They wanted to see and explore how can we create an experience to where they already believe in the open source Red Hat technology. They already believe that we are technical experts inside of the open source technology space. And we had this culture. Jim Whitehurst talked a lot around our culture at Red Hat, and people said, I want to see a bit more about that. I want to see if you can blend the culture, the way of doing, with the technical expertise in this enterprise grade world-class solution. And so Red Hat Open Innovation Labs was created as part of that experiment. And it was really a way for customers to learn to build, great products the open source way. Right. We determined that an immersive residency type experience, meaning that it is both customer and Red Hat technical experts getting together and pairing as engineers in order to transform the ideas that they had inside of their business that they wanted to do, really focusing in on those business outcomes, and then doing so the open source way. And so the residency framework was designed such that we can start exploring and discovering a challenge space, a problem space, coming up with a solution, and then utilizing a time-boxed amount of time in order to get towards that solution, get directive in what we want to accomplish. And what that boils down to is we want to solve business challenges. we want to solve for these kinds of outcomes, deliver something of value. And we understand that one size does not fit all. We used a lot of lean, a lot of agile, scrum, kanban. These methodologies we pulled and created inside of that time box, because the time box also floated between, it was like 6 and 12 weeks. You can only do so many sprints in 6 weeks. But through this like curated set of practices, these open practices that you can find at like an open practice library, we were able to curate a custom set of practices that we were expert practitioners on, and we were creating that to solve and drive real business value. And so we were really kind of focusing in on delivering something small, like a minimum viable product that we could then move forward with.
So when you were speaking, I was like thinking, putting some keywords together. So we used to call that engagement a residency, which was anything between 8 to 12 weeks. And the whole idea was to move beyond philosophy of open source, but focus on applicability, and then to deliver something of value, as you said, using agile methodologies and custom set of practices. At the end of those 12 weeks, we had a minimal viable product. That's where I find the whole idea of using agile practices and open source principles into moving at that speed. I think it was what you said, velocity, and not so much as speed, getting those outcomes in that short span of time. So we also kind of change or revolutionize how outcomes and how soon they can be achieved. Because earlier there was a mindset that any kind of change or product development could take a year or 2 years time. But here we were saying here's a minimal viable product which functions, and it can be done in a period of time if you use the right practices and the right methodology.
Something that you mentioned, and I actually want to go back to it real quick, is focusing in on outcomes is where you want to be. But there's a very clear distinction that I want to also make, is you need to have the right, appropriate outcomes. You can't just have any outcome, because then you could be headed in the wrong direction, which is why discovery type techniques, like things from design thinking, become incredibly important, because you may think that you have a good outcome, but it may not be the outcome that your product needs, the outcome that your company needs, because you need to balance desirability of what it is that you're the outcome that you're driving towards, the viability, is it good for your business, and the feasibility, can you build it without like wrecking anything else or having to completely shift technical foundations and architectures that you already have?
And those are just right there, the 3 or 4 good questions to ask before you start using. I'm already enjoying our conversation now.
I'm getting excited, but I find that I want to also make sure that change is such an interesting word, because there is creating change and like the change mindset to where you are in creating something different inside your organization, right? People talk about like change culture, or leveraging frameworks like Cotter or AdCar. These are like frameworks at which you can instigate change. I think it's important that while those things are super important, because it gives you a bit of like a framework of how to go about that change, in order to do some of this change within you and be an agent for change, you actually need to embody specific kinds of characteristics. And this is actually, I think this is like maybe even teeing you up here, but it's like, that's where I feel that like open leadership kind of comes into place, because you are changing an individual type of mindset, or understanding even where you kind of are, and then you can start saying, okay, now if I get better at this, my change that I want to create in my organization actually becomes easier.
Yeah, you're right. And you mentioned AdCard and these frameworks. I remember large part of the work, especially when it came to individuals. So whenever we're talking about change, we'll always have to talk about resistance, and resistance at multiple levels. The number one resistance, of course, begins with the self, because while we love change, it's kind of paradoxical that we want change and we want things to evolve and get better, but as humans we're also averse to change. The resistance that comes in, it's a big ask. Have adults, grown-ups, to make changes in behaviors and thinking and mindset, because again goes back to brain science and neuroscience and how our neural pathways are sort of wired. And it's heavy lifting, it's not as easy as done. And that's, we need to use methods and techniques and practices that allows for that change to happen so that we can mitigate the resistance, right? It's not that you'll change as a person completely, but making those shifts to fit in and to go along with the proposed change. That's where the role of the organizations and leaders come in, to understand true challenges and then being empathetic, and at the same time using systems thinking in a way that facilitates or at least motivates people to go in that direction. There's a whole sort of science around it, and I'm always fascinated at the amount of ask we have of people and employees. But then we've also seen the magic with the work that we have done within the scope of open leadership, and also with our own open residencies that we did. I'm glad you threw that bit in as well. It always makes you think. But again, I don't want to veer off the agenda today, because you and I can always go in different directions. So I'm being very mindful. As you can see, I'm trying. So Matt, what is Agile, and what are the Agile principles that we hear so much about?
Yeah, so I'm not going to just read. So there are 12 principles total from the Agile Manifesto. And I actually just want to call out a few of them, but then kind of expand on the intent behind a lot of these principles. Some of the principles, right, be open to change, right? You need to kind of related to the adaptability for the open leadership side, right? You want continuous collaboration. You want to measure whatever progress that you move forward in. And, customer satisfaction is what you are striving for. And in order to achieve these principles that you are driving for, you build support and trust the team that ends up being created as you're driving towards this. And these are the key principles of Agile project management that you're really driving for. What it kind of boils down to is something that you may or may not have seen throughout. It's called like the 4 key values. And it's basically we like this more than this, but you need both kind of style, right? Because you want individuals and interactions, right? You need people to have autonomy over a lot of the actions that they can take and decisions that they're able to make. And you want that kind of mentality over processes and tools. You need processes and tools, but you do want to focus in on enabling these individuals and creating these interactions, these positive interactions. The other one is customer collaboration over contract negotiation. If you set in time a contract, and that contract is even for a few months, something is likely to change, or you need to modify what that contract really is in order to achieve the value that you are driving for. Coming back to that principle of like you're driving towards that customer satisfaction, that delivery of the outcomes. So as opposed to just having a contract negotiation that gives you an initial direction, you need to have continual feedback loops for customer collaboration, right? You need to foster this open dialogue so that you understand when a pivot needs to happen, this is how I can accomplish that. And you don't want to get stuck in analysis paralysis through comprehensive documentation or continual discovery to find like every aspect in minutia that needs to be done during delivery. Deliver something, because you know what brings the best feedback is putting something in front of other people, creating that working software, and then having people give feedback on something that they can see. If you're in the IT industry, you might have heard of things like wireframes or design documents. There's even a tool called Figma that you can actually create like clicking walkthroughs of like what a product would even kind of feel like. And if you were to just give a set of requirements that implement those kinds of things, a user is never going to be able to click through that and say, 6 clicks too many. I just need 1. I want 1 click. Or, I cannot believe that you made the font so tiny for this super important little bit. It needs to pop out because you know what? I did it wrong. That user feedback through that delivery of working software over just the documentation aspects is what we're trying to go through. And then you need to be able to respond to change. And that's a business change, that is a requirement change, that is even personnel change. You have to have flexibility to be able to respond to whatever that change is, versus just marching towards a plan, right? You're gonna fall like lemmings when you come to a suspension bridge that has somehow deteriorated and fallen. You want to be able to go, whoa, 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 everyone stop. Let's rethink that, rebuild the bridge, rebuild that foundation so that I can get to the other side. And if you're keeping track or writing down your own notes as you're listening and watching this, there's a lot of overlapping between how we look to handle adaptability, both at now a personal level as a leader, but also as a team and the way that we try and manage work. Same with collaboration. Well, actually, those are the two direct overlaps.
It's amazing. Like, because I'm listening and I'm like, oh, I have a lot of questions as well. I relate to a lot of things that you said. One thought that was running in my mind when you were explaining that, of course, it sounds almost unreal going through these principles, and does it really happen, especially when it comes to user feedback? There's this whole element of like you're pausing, taking feedback, and then you're incorporating that feedback and course correcting, right, vis-a-vis completing the whole, let's say, whole process, and then going back and testing it out, right? And I'm just wondering, does it not slow the process down to pause and then get feedback and incorporate it? Isn't it easier to just go through with what we have aimed to do as a team, create that, and then take a feedback like towards the end?
I would ask the question, slows down the speed for what? If you recall a little bit earlier around the distinction between velocity and speed, right? It's like the difference between a vector and an array. If we want to go into mathy terms, a vector has a direction and magnitude versus an array just has like its size.
Yeah.
And so speed is a lot like that. If you are speeding, let's say I'm going 65 miles an hour or 100 kilometers an hour, right? And that's the information that I give to you. You're like, cool, you're going fast. But if my goal, if my objective, my outcome was to get from one city to another, am I progressing towards that outcome?
The answer is no. Yes.
You just know how fast I'm going.
Yes.
So am I headed in the right direction or not? You don't know. This is kind of like one of these, like when you were talking around like the feedback loops, are we going slower or faster? Am I going slower or faster towards what becomes the question. Yeah. And so what feedback loops really give you in the form of like feedback from the users or customers of whatever product that you are developing, actually what you're getting from that is an understanding of where you are and how fast you're going, right? You're now starting to track a bit of like the velocity. So if I'm going from city to city and I am driving 65, so I use miles per hour, like I will use kilometers. I will use
that's so helpful.
Kilometers an hour. So if I'm going 100 kilometers an hour and I'm all of a sudden we go, oh, we're going to do a feedback loop real quick. And this is an interim one. And this is actually the 100 kilometers an hour that I did. And I do a feedback right here. And I go, oh yeah, I don't have Google Maps on my phone, but I just have the handy dandy paper map. And so I go for an hour and then I stop. And I start reflecting back, and I know I want to get from city to city, and I go, where am I on the map? I've driven in this direction. Oh, I am here. I now understand that in order to get to where I want to go, I now need to pivot, because if I kept going, I was going to miss. And now I know that I'm here. And so now I'm going to right size myself and say, okay, I'm going to now go 100 kilometers in a different direction. And I go, boop, I go down here.
Yeah.
Right? I am now infinitely closer to where my outcome is. So actually, I would say your speed towards your outcome gets faster if you implement feedback loops in between versus if you were to just keep going towards a plan and were to reflect at the end, because you're going to likely miss your target.
That makes such a lot of sense, Matt. Thank you. Yeah. I was having this conversation with Chris Bainham Hughes and, recording one of the podcasts with him. And we had a similar discussion around how going slow to go fast, right? This keeps coming back, that it's not always about going fast right from the beginning. It's okay to take that time and have these pit stops, as you say, and course correct, instead of just rushing in one direction and then realizing that you're really way off the mark. There was another thing you mentioned about flexibility and adaptability, the ability to think not only when you're designing the software or the product, but also your own personal level of flexibility and adaptability, right? Does this refer back to the same thing what we were talking about, mindsets and change, and to minimize resistance?
Yeah, and I'm gonna draw a quick parallel around like change is never done, and relating it back to both like delivery at a team level, but also at an individual like open leadership kind of like change. Because if you brilliant leaders, some of the best leaders that I have worked with, continuously challenge themselves to be better at various open leadership characteristics. I want to be better about transparency. I want to be better around like adapting both how I convey direction, but also with what that direction might actually end up being. And so when leaders constantly turn it into themselves, they are going to continuously change. And those are some of the most brilliant leaders that I have worked with. Not the ones that always have the answer, that always make the good, best decisions. They can have a few. And maybe it's luck, maybe it's the fact that they just prepared incredibly well. But when a challenge comes, when they're asked the harder questions, leaders that aren't constantly changing and living the best that they can from the open leadership characteristics perspective, they start to fold. And they start to fold and become defensive, and they start to fold and make more decisions versus continually asking, being inclusive and collaborative, and relying on so much community knowledge that they start making bad decisions or not optimal decisions. And that happens with teams as well. Because when teams seek to make all these decisions without getting feedback from their end users, they will continually make suboptimal decisions for the product that they're trying to serve on other people. So many times in some of the customers that I've worked with, they have a platform that they're trying to create or implement, and they are making design and use decisions at a platform level because of what is best feasibly or architected in the best way. And then they are sending that to an application team, and the application team goes, I don't want to use that. But it's too hard because it's too different, and they're not comfortable with it. The platform team now has two options, right? They can either change and adapt based on whatever that feedback is, or they can start collaborating with that team. One is reactive, one is proactive. For me, in the teams that I have seen that actually end up moving faster and implement a solution that is more widely adopted, you're proactively collaborating, proactively changing by seeing and including others as you're delivering anything for you.
In fact, it reminded me when you said that often there's a tendency of leaders and even teams to start taking decisions or start controlling methods is also coming from a place of fear, for a simple reason that, especially in product teams, and we're talking about community way of leading, and open leadership requires to tap into that common knowledge, the universal knowledge which is available within that community or within that team. And one of the fears that gets triggered in leaders or in product teams is like, okay, so are we now irrelevant, right? Where is that self-importance? Or what about my position and my authority? And do I not have the power and control? I mean, so you see, it goes to more intrinsic needs and fears related to those. And often that was large part of our work within the open leadership coaching context, was to work with leaders to help them understand that their role is elevated, it's not minimized, right? They're really actually practicing more of strategic leadership than hardcore management. But again, it comes back to the whole point of that mindset, right? How am I looking? Am I being very territorial? Am I being very controlling? As a team, sometimes we can get very attached to the work that we do and the outcomes that we want. Sometimes we can become very close to the feedback. So it makes sense to me when you mentioned that we need to have these regular feedback loops so that it also keeps us humble and tuned in.
It's also, and I want to also just be clear with the folks watching and listening. An open leader is not a manager, and an open leader is not someone that is like a director or someone high in any sort of like an organization, right? An open leader is anybody down to the individual contributor at the associate level, at the junior level. You can be an open leader. Right? It's about being able to keep in mind that people are people, they're not machines, and about how you are continuously driving for an improved situation, an improved culture inside of your team, an improved way that people perceive you as being inclusive, collaborative, transparent, because these are the characteristics that constantly be touted by more senior leaders inside the company. But when you exude those characteristics, when you continuously evolve your ability to do these things, you will find yourself in that kind of leadership position. And just know that you are never done. You always need to constantly evolve yourself. To me, the one of the biggest, I'm gonna say tells, right? I'll call them like a tell that you will notice as an open leader is when people are able to challenge you while still being respectful. You listen and they feel like they are engaged and made an impact. When you find that kind of situation, whenever you're sharing a decision or a direction or anything like that, or as an individual contributor or as a manager director, when you get that situation, you know you are down a good path for open leadership characteristics because you've created that psychological safety, that trust in your ecosystem.
I'm really, enjoying listening to, the way you're sharing and the way you're creating this overlay or connection between open leadership and agile practices and agile ways of working. I always say this, Matt, that open leadership, while it's a philosophy, it's always powered by things like agile, lean, design thinking. It doesn't stand by itself. Like, to bring open leadership to life, we need all of these together. And I'm glad that we're having a conversation to show or illustrate how this works out. And maybe I can ask you a question more from an exploratory perspective. You work a lot with product teams worldwide. I'm interested in learning a bit about your experiences with such teams where you are driving agile mindset, where you work towards applying open leadership principles. Is there any unique challenge that stood out for you, or something that you see happening recurringly, that as a pattern that, when you work with product teams, this is going to happen?
It's funny that you ask, because I was going to ask you if I could share an example, maybe not specifically to your question, but I think it's related, and I can't get it out of my head. So just tell me if I don't fully answer your actual question here. I will try. When a lot of teams get together and they are trying to solve some sort of a problem, there's a symptom that I see in some of these teams, and it's being pressured to provide like a return on investment for the project, for the product, or whatever we're trying to develop. And this is so that they can justify the effort and time that their teams are work before we even begin. They're trying to say, tell me what my return on investment is, usually expressed in some sort of like dollars amount, or I need X amount of scope completed in X amount of time, right? Those are the typical things that we're kind of seeing. Alternatively, if you're like in a bigger kind of transformation, some director or a VP comes and goes, implement the thing, give me the DevOps, or find just migrate from platform X to platform Y, right? Like make it happen. And it's an output with a specific ask without actually understanding some specific intent or the expectation, the driver, the outcome that we're trying to drive for. And we need to be open to being able to ask those kinds of questions. As a leader, we need to be comfortable, safe enough in a trusting relationship to ask that question so that we can actually find a slightly better of an answer. At the team kind of level, I have seen people struggle with being able to respond to the ROI that's not just giving them data, that they don't know how it's going to be used. They don't know why they're trying to create that kind of a data. And so undergoing transparency and really kind of like being transparent up can be incredibly helpful. Hey, this is the data. This is what our data means, right? If you were tracking velocity, right, tell them what velocity means. If you were tracking speed of a process, tell them what it means about that process. But also ask the questions of, does this actually answer what you're trying to do, right? We talked about short feedback loops earlier, right? This is an example of trying to do so to uncover what that ROI actually means, what actually is the intent and outcome that we're kind of like driving for at a team level.
So you're asking them to kind of define, like create definitions of what this means so that the teams are not operating at a level of assumption, because I could have a different assumption of an ROI and my leader could have a very different assumption of that.
Yes, exactly. That kind of like a transparency, because sometimes you don't have that kind of alignment. You asked also specifically around practices. I have found that if someone is in a scenario and they are being asked to implement like a platform, and that platform just needs to improve the ability for an application teams to deliver more features, right? That is the direction, right? Probably something's very similar is happening to a lot of organizations. And you're being tasked to say, oh, by the way, I need you to make that happen. What do you actually end up caring about? I was working with a team, and we had that. That was all the direction that we were able to give. And wanting to be like an open leader and having discussions with one of like our main stakeholder, the person that we worked with most directly, even though they weren't the person that was like the sponsor of the project. This person also wanted to do what the right thing was, but needed to do the right thing, but still convey that value that was being requested. And we opted to utilize 3 different practices from the Open Practice Library, and we combined 2 of them and utilized 1 of them. That was empathy mapping, because we needed to understand like who we were building this for. So we used empathy mapping to uncover app dev persona. But as we were doing that, we realized that in this organization, the app dev persona was actually 2 different personas. One was the dev, right, the actual developer doing work, and the other was actually a developer manager or project manager in some cases. And this is the person that handled a lot of like a ticketing process. And these 2 are very different people in the organization. Empathy mapping helped us uncover this. And then we leveraged a combination of 2 practices. One of them was a service blueprint practice, and the other was metrics-based process mapping. Service blueprint is great for uncovering like empathy with the users that you are developing a system for, and uncovering deeper layers of the way that the system behaves in order to create the seamless experience for the user. But you start at the user's experience and the way they want to experience use of whatever you are looking to build. When it comes to a platform and you have this mentality of platform engineering or platform as a product, your users are the users of your product, right? And so you need to think of it in that kind of a manner. And so that's what Service Blueprint gave us. Metrics-based process mapping is what we took for each of the user interactions, and sometimes at the system level, at the like the background system, and we identified process time and lead time. So process time and lead time, we did percent accurate and complete, but it was less of an important metric as it was process time and lead time. If you are not overly familiar with metrics-based process mapping, process time is the amount of time that you're actually doing the work, and lead time is the amount of time that it's doing the work plus any of the wait times, any of the queuing to get from one step to the next step. Because sometimes you will uncover that your process time is like maybe a couple of hours, but your lead time is like 2 days. Because of emails, queuing, ticket systems, there's a lot of back and forth that needs to happen, or thinking time, or that happens. And so queuing is very important, that lead time and process time differential. We ran through those practices. The application team and the platform team that we were working with had never really had a conversation beyond just doing the work. And it was constantly the platform team telling the application team how to use the system that they were developing. So there was this constant back and forth that they were going through that took a lot of time. Even though they kept implementing and improving the documentation behind use of what their platform was and automation scripts that helped the system back end stuff, they were still struggling with lead time to be creating the value that they were doing, which was a migration of an app from an old way of provisioning and servicing up the app to a new way of doing so. And so through the service blueprint, the platform team started asking the same kinds of questions, just in a different way, and actually listening and conversing and collaborating with the app teams. And so they actually started having different solutions. They were able to uncover an empathetic place that was the biggest pain points that the application teams were having, so that when it came down to prioritization of everything that they could do, they focused in on this one thing. They delivered the one thing in about 2 weeks' time. And when they showed the users, the application teams, of like, hey, here is a new way to create your own namespaces inside of our platform. It blew their minds, because previously it took 24 to 48 hours to do this. And we showed them a way that they could get it done in 20-ish minutes.
Wow.
And so we shortened that time by this one thing that we could provide value for. And it was through the conversation between both of these teams, empathizing with them by having the discussion, and then tracking the metrics, we were able to show quantifiable return on investment of that time. And so coming all the way back, right, to that return on investment conversation, we were able to do so through using these kind of 3 tactics. The other fun thing that I did that is not part of either of those practices is I made smiley faces and unsmiley faces from the app team's perspective about every step. And so I said, hey, how does this make you feel? And so we had happy faces, medium faces, angry faces, and one of them made into a vampire, because that was like the worst of them all. But that one ended up being one that we couldn't actually influence. It was actually 3 other teams that we would have needed to bring in, and we didn't have the flexibility and the capability to bring in those types of people at that time.
It sounds like you incorporated in the last bit a little bit of fun and exchange in a light-hearted way. I would say, like, in such a human-centric way. People are working with each other, and it doesn't have to be like so stiff and rigid and monotonous, but these practices, there's scope for being this element of exchange and feedback.
We merged that practice, and it stemmed from wanting to I wanted to impart more of like the open leadership characteristics for like our software. And that person was also receptive of it and wanted to do more of that kind of thing as well. When we had a conversation that was very open, able to drive down that path. And so we backed into a set of practices to implement at the team level, so that we could both be aligned with the ROI, the team's able to progress for like minimum viable products, so like a slice of value of working software. And we were able to also increase the collaborative and inclusive nature of the 2 individuals that were the tech lead and the project sponsor, of like their open leadership abilities inside of that organization, which was incredibly helpful, because as we went through, we started sharing what we were doing. Other people in VP started having conversations and started asking about more. And they were interested in like what was being built and such, but they were actually more interested in going, whatever you did was way faster than we were able to go. Again, it was the big E word, empathy with people. But also just making sure that we collaborate with folks that are able to actually progress alignment and forwardness of the outcome.
Example that you've given, and when you're narrating the practices and how they were implemented, I mean, in my head, I was like putting a label to each of this. Okay, that sounds like transparency. Oh, that seems like creating collaboration. Oh, that seems like inclusivity to me. So all of these practices, and that's what I mean, open leadership is powered by these practices, and the agile methodology creates that space. So it's just not like buzzwords that we are throwing around, right? When you were sharing about these 3 practices, empathy mapping, blueprint, and the MVP, one thought that was also spinning in my head was, These seem like very detailed practices, right? So you're for each practice, you're working with the team, which means you're including everyone. It's inclusive. But I'm just curious to know how much time typically would each practice take, right?
I'm going to give a generalization because it ultimately depends on so service blueprint is really dependent upon the size and scale of what you're trying to blueprint it yourself. Same with APM, right? Are you is the process that you're trying to map specifically from code start to delivery to dev, or is it actually requirements gathering and to prod? So the time it takes depends on kind of like those levels of guardrails. For something like empathy mapping, if you're doing something quick, half hour to an hour. The reason for the time box is actually so that you don't dwell too far onto the details, but you get enough to kind of have a conversation that's beyond surface level demographical information or like the top 5 of responsibility that these people kind of like have.
Okay.
You need to get a bit lower into that, a bit more into the detail, which is why you give a little bit more time, but not too much time if you're doing like trying to rapidly create the personas.
Yeah, so it doesn't have to be too detailed, but you could have a criteria for the persona and you just go ahead and do it. You use the term time box. I'm familiar with it, but could you explain it to our audience what that means?
Yeah, so time box is actually a great forcing constraint for you to have important conversations before the time kind of runs out. So you give yourself a time frame to accomplish the intent and outcome of a specific practice or activity. If you and I were to create a time box for like introductions, right? And introductions, we would say, okay, we know we have a lot to cover. Let's make sure that our introductions are no more than 7 minutes. And so like when we start introductions, we know what the outcome that we want to do. We want to introduce ourselves and share a little bit of insight around our personalities. We have 7 minutes to do it. So between the two of us, we need to reach that outcome in 7 minutes. Start, boom, timer. And then that time box helps make sure that you actually have the forcing function to have the conversation without going too far, diverging from the original intent. The facilitation format is sometimes dictated by the practice itself, but the facilitator also has tools that you can apply in order to ensure collaboration and inclusivity of the folks that are gathered. So like there are liberating structures that help to do it, like 1, 2, 4 all. There is kind of like the general questions, or like, hey, those that have spoken, it's time to flip, right? Let's hear from those that have not spoken as much, and you can use that facilitation technique to start making sure that you do include more than just the folks that like to talk, and that becomes very helpful because you get a lot of really neat nuggets and even new perspectives. The other thing that I was gonna mention, coming back to your timing, it took us about a full 6-hour day in order to do our service blueprint, and we did some lightweight of the metrics-based process mapping. So the metrics that were on top of everything. We did not fully execute upon all the detail that we originally planned on doing. We actually ended up adapting and pivoting as we reached the initial outcome that we wanted, which was identifying the initial steps from a user perspective, and then a lot of the prep kickoff ticketing that was needed on like the back end. And we identified 3 key areas that we wanted to actually improve. And then we just took that slice, and that's what we actually fleshed out even further. So we actually pivoted in the middle of everything versus trying to accomplish what the practice needed to do as an output thing. And we actually made sure that we reached the intent and the outcome of the practice that we needed to do in order to progress forward. So we actually took an adaptive approach in order to create the outcome that was needed, even in the middle of doing this practice. And again, that was 6 hours. And from there, we had enough detail that we were able to craft a 4-week backlog of activities that we wanted to do, things we needed to investigate, things that we needed to implement. And we were able to put that inside of like a tracking tool, and we were able to really move forward.
Matt, I have a layman question and it's about teaming. Generally, in such engagements, do you have, like, is there a specific team size, or it is really dependent on the kind of engagement that you're delivering?
I'm going to give you an it depends. But I do think that there's a max. And I think the max is when communication starts breaking down. Typically, when you talk to Scrum, when you talk about a lot of like agile teams, there's that whole concept of like the two pizza team. But you know, a pizza can be an individual pizza if you try hard enough. So I would kind of put it into, I have seen communication start breaking down when you get beyond 10 people. Beyond 10 people, it becomes harder to coordinate. It becomes harder for the communication to stay open. And you always end up having people that end up being closed off or are more difficult when it comes to the team dynamic that you seek to do. Now, it's not unsurmountable, but it does become a lot harder when you get beyond that amount of people.
Okay, no, this is really interesting conversation. I can go on asking you questions, Matt, but I want to respect your time as well. So what I want to do is I want to narrow it down, shift the gears, and bring the conversation to you as an individual, as an open leader, because while we're teaching and talking about open leadership, it's a very reflective process. You don't get away teaching something without it having impact you, right? So there are 5 characteristics of open leadership: transparency, inclusivity, collaboration, community, and adaptability. So out of these 5 characteristics, is there any one particular or 2 characteristics that you found a little hard to embrace or a little challenging to apply?
So I think while I want to answer with just trust is the one of the hardest kinds of things. That's more of like a foundation thing at which all the other characteristics sit upon. So I'm gonna end up saying transparency. So it seems like it wouldn't be one of the hardest things, but I think identifying and changing how you are being transparent is really hard. It's not a switch. Most people think of it as a switch of like, either I don't share a lot of the information or I share all of the information. But there's actually a right level of looking to share for specific people, because you need to appropriately communicate your intent. And you can't do it if you share too much information or if you share too little information. So you need to figure out what that appropriate amount of transparency is to your actual audience. Because at the end of the day, you are trying to craft a story. And you're trying to craft a story so that you can express what your intent is. And you need a certain granularity of information in order to create that impact that you're really kind of desiring. And figuring all that stuff out I find is really difficult. It's difficult for me. It's difficult for people I talk to. And most just default to say, I'm an open book. I'm happy to share whatever.
Yeah.
And then someone asks a question and you get inundated with information that doesn't actually help you.
Yeah.
Because you needed someone to distill some of that information in order to actually answer your question. And people aren't even open or willing to share that level of transparent information if you don't have the trust, which is kind of why I wanted to start with trust.
Gotcha. Yeah.
I want to have that cop-out trust answer.
Yeah.
But no, right? Yeah. That psychological safety, that trust in individual relationships between the people is how a leader can actually be and understand what an appropriate amount of transparency actually is. I know this is probably a follow-on question that you're going to ask. How do you look to be more or less kind of transparent and make it more of like a slider versus a switch?
Yes.
And the answer is I don't have a good answer.
Yeah.
It's so
contextual, right?
It is try something out. Yeah. I default to having more information, but follow up with that person of like, did I give you too much? Was this an appropriate amount of information? And can we have a like follow-on conversation after you have a chance to digest some of that stuff? Yeah. Because sometimes people are really good at connecting the dots. Other times people aren't good at connecting the dots. Those that are good at connecting the dots can take all of the information and still make their own conclusion. You still need to validate the conclusion. Now you've actually figured out what an appropriate level of information is for that person.
Yeah.
It could be different from the other thing that transparency is seeking to create. So, as a characteristic, it is seeking to create alignment, understanding, and directional capabilities for your teams, for people that are interacting with one another.
That makes a lot of sense. I also think because you have this sort of a pre-existing trust, or if the culture of the team sort of allows for it, it's easier because then you have a context. Like, I'd like to talk in terms of context because there are never yes, no, right, wrong answers. So Matt, before we wrap up for today, I do want to ask you if you have any advice to open leaders and practitioners looking to start integrating open leadership and agile in their organizations.
Top out answer first. Try something. As we were talking about earlier, if you're constantly seeking for change, you're constantly seeking to improve and evolve a characteristic, figure out what about that characteristic that you, what toggle you kind of like want to switch. Do you want to be more transparent? Do you want to be more collaborative? Okay, what about collaboration do I actually want to be more about? And then find a practice that helps you do that. Google it, go to openpracticelibrary.com, go to liberating structures if you're trying to drive more open kind of like a dialogue or an inclusive dialogue, or talk to someone about it. It does not have to be an open leader expert. And you don't have to talk to Schaffner to get a strong answer for this.
Yeah.
Like, just talk to someone and say, hey, I actually want to be a bit more collaborative with this team. This is what we're currently doing. I'm thinking about trying to do this. What do you think? If you start that conversation, you are getting started. You are making a change for yourself to be a more better and more open leader. Those are the two places I say, like get started, take a look over there, but reflect at the end of it. If you don't reflect, the first two don't matter.
Great advice. Thank you. And just one last question. If people want to connect with you, Matt, what is a way that they could connect with you or engage with you?
Best way would be LinkedIn. You can also shoot me an email, but that's a lot harder with the amount of emails that I have. But I think give me a LinkedIn message, give me a connect. As long as you have a picture and you write something of like, hey, I saw you here. I know where you're from, and I'm happy to make the acquaintance.
So with that, Matt, I really want to thank you for being here today, sharing your wisdom and insights, and just amazing learning today. And I look forward to having you back at a later date because there's so many topics we haven't covered. So thank you once again.
I would love to. It was so great chatting with you every time. It's always such a pleasure. Your smile brings sunshine to my world.
You're lovely.